Now we are going to talk about paintbrushes. If you're new at painting, which these videos are for, you're wondering what kind of paintbrushes to get. And the most obvious answer is get the cheap ones. And that would be the worst thing to do. So you want quality brushes, maybe at a low price, but you want to get the right kind because there's so many different shapes out there. And you want to be practical about this. You don't want to buy brushes that makes painting frustrating. I have here 7 different types of paintbrushes. I have brights, flats, filberts, eggberts, rounds, detail, and fan brushes. And I'm going to tell you what they're used for. Flats and brights are very similar, but the hairs on the brights are shorter. The shorter hairs make the brush firmer. The longer hairs make them more flexible and softer. And that's one way of describing a brush, if it's firm or if it's soft. And they have different purposes. So a bright is really good for scrubbing in colors. A flat is great for painting one layer on top of another layer. So you want those extra long hairs to maintain control when painting wet on wet. I usually don't buy the brights because I have older brushes that wear down and they become great scrubber brushes, so I have no need for buying brights. These two I think I bought by mistake and I've used them once. So most of the time I just use old brushes for scrubbing. So that helps me understand maybe brushes I don't need to get. The filberts here are kind of like the flats in that they're narrow on one side and wide on the other side, but the filberts are round on top. And that gives it a capability of doing a wider range of paint strokes than the flats would be. So a lot of portrait artists will use these filberts because they really like the way it gives them softer textures. Where if you're wanting something more dynamic, the flats give you beautiful chiseled textures that can make a painting interesting too. If you're gonna buy paintbrushes for the first time, I recommend getting a set of filberts first to paint with them. And if you have some extra money, then get some flats to go with them. And you can do a lot with these 2 different types of brushes. Another type of brush is called the eggberts. The eggberts are just like the filberts, but the hairs are extra long. And so it makes them a softer brush. In other words, they create less pressure when the brush touches the canvas. And you're able to do some really great textures with these. They also may be known as extra long filberts with some brush companies, but other companies will call them eggberts. And I love these when I'm doing textures. I'm loving them when I'm building up many layers of paint. So maybe the first 2 layers of paints, I may use my filberts. And when I get into layer 3 and 4, then I'll switch to my eggberts and I can get some really nice strokes with those. The rounds are just like they sound. They are a round brush. They're not flat at all. And so they're very dense in hairs. This is the brush I would recommend that you not get as a beginner painter because it's harder to control the amount of paint and the surface with these rounds. You end up using a lot more paint and you'll struggle with getting anything smooth if you need it smooth. It's not as practical as the other brushes, but once you get better at painting, then you might pick up a couple of them and experiment with them and see what you think about them. You're definitely going to be using a lot more paint with them. You'll have a lot less control. Now I'm going to move to the detail brush. Let's see, I got to put this up against a white surface because it's tiny. The hairs on this are probably a ½ inch long, very narrow. This brush is called a detail liner brush. Liner brushes can get usually from a ½ inch long up to 1 inch long or even longer, depending on the need. And these are great for signing your paintings, and they're also great for detail work. So if I'm doing a portrait and I'm working around the eyes, this is the brush that I pull out and use a lot of. And I have different brands of these, and they have slightly different lengths, and so it gives me options for when I'm doing really tight, super tight detail work. The last brush I want to talk to you about is the fan brush, and it's just like what it sounds. It looks like a fan. Back in the days, hundreds of years ago, they would use feathers to do the same thing. And when these brushes came out, they called them feather brushes, and they also call it feathering, the technique that we use. But what this does is once you get your paint on the canvas, you can go back over with these fan brushes very lightly, and you can create a super soft, almost airbrush-like feel on your painting if you want to get it that soft. They're also great for getting rid of glares and stuff. In another video, I'll talk about all the little paint tricks you can do to get rid of issues in your painting. So after talking about all these brushes, as a brand new artist, one who hasn't been painting that long, I highly recommend you getting a good set of the Filberts and get a wide range of sizes. And anytime you start something new, you know, if you want to get into sculpting, if you want to get into painting, my advice is always start small. So I would get brushes, Filberts, from size 2 to size 8. When we talk about sizes, this is the frustration that a lot of artists have nowadays. Many years ago, there was a standard to the size. If you said, I'm getting a size 8 in a certain brand, if you go to another brand and get a size 8, you're pretty much getting the same size brush. But now, ever since the synthetics have come out, a size 8 may look like this brush right here, and in another brand, a size 8 may look like this. That's a big difference. So I don't know what advice to give you. On some websites, they'll actually have a ruler nearby and it'll show you the sizes, so it's kind of hard to know. As far as what brand to buy, if you are trying to save money, then I would experiment. I would get some cheap brushes and play with them and see if you like them, and then buy a couple more expensive brushes and compare them. And then you'll know exactly what's more meaningful to you in painting. Sometimes a brush can get so cheap that it makes it frustrating to paint. But then there are some very expensive brushes that I find no better for painting than some of these cheaper brushes. They perform just as well. Let me talk about the different fibers that are being used. We have in this brush, this is what we call natural hog's hair. It comes from hogs. And it cleans a little bit differently and it paints a little differently than the synthetics. The natural hog's hair gives you more of a textured feel, where the synthetics will give you a little bit more of a smoother feel. The synthetics don't separate as organically as a natural hair brush, so it gives you a very uniform look compared to a hog's hair brush. We also get into squirrel and we get into sable and stuff like that. For a beginner, I highly recommend not getting those. They're very expensive, but once you get into painting, you might try those out. So you can try out both the natural hair brushes and the synthetics. I like working back and forth with both depending on what I'm doing, depending on what techniques I'm doing, and so that'll be for another video also. Again, let me state this again. As a starter, I recommend getting the Filberts, but I would recommend getting natural hair Filberts, hog hair Filberts. And then maybe pick up a set of synthetics. And then you have slightly softer feel, more uniform, and rougher, more natural, traditional brushes. And go back and forth. You'll definitely see the difference on the performance. And I hope this helped.